Testing, testing. Good morning. Seems fine. Good morning, dear friends. As the weather where I live in Wisconsin turns colder, all I want in life is a cup of hot tea or coffee and big floofy blankets that make lots of noise on microphones that I'm not even sure are working, and a book. Story time. I love nothing more than story time, and particularly when we can't walk all together through local independent bookstores. It was really nice one day to have a singer actually stop and read stories and poetry, and it was so lovely, and it was such a nice part of my day and such a great piece of pandemic coping that I thought I would like to offer the same. In my world, everybody loves story time, not just me, my kids, my family, my besties. And so let's have more story time. And in order to not violate someone else's copyrights by reading you an entire book of somebody else's, maybe one of these. There, that good. I will have to read you from my book, Ophelia Immune. I'm going to put my coffee down. In order to not violate someone else's copyright, I don't want to give you a whole bunch of other people's stories, but I feel very comfortable giving away my own writings. I have a couple of qualms about reading this. I think that we've all had some added trauma to our lives, not just with the pandemic, but definitely with the pandemic, and there's definitely a contagious element of this that I wrote, and I've definitely had some personal trauma related to kids since I wrote this. And I think we've had a lot of social justice and racial and immigration relative trauma since I wrote this. But I'm hoping that this will work on a couple of levels. I'm hoping this will work on the level of me not just being some white lady author writing white male characters, which I've had enough of. This is not that. I don't give you a protagonist who is a little white boy. And I think that this will work on the level of, it's almost Halloween, almost Samhain, almost Day of the Dead. And I think that that works sometimes for catharsis and to re-examine our ideas about life and death and ancestors and struggle and gore, and in fact catharsis of, let's lean into some gore and some terror, and there's time to sit with it and ultimately brush it off. That those don't control us year round because we've given them a place on the calendar and a season. So I have some Halloween candles going over here. And then another is that when I'm facing trauma in life, I like to add an element of inspection, and that often involves imagination. I like to take a character and put them in the middle of the complete and utter shit show so that I can guide them through it. And if I can get somebody through this level of trauma and terror, then maybe that's just a tiny part of how we all get through trauma and tough situations. And maybe story time is also that. Maybe story time is also us wanting to not just see a character successfully get through trauma and become a hero, but also that authors giving story times and offering our writings so that we don't violate others' copyrights is part of what the world needs in a really tough moment. Maybe that's a tiny part of what we can do, is go ahead and give each other story time. So, my book is called Ophelia Immune. I haven't read it in 2 years since it came out, so I'm sure I will stumble over my own words, and I'm only about half the way through my morning cup of coffee. But these are words that I am free to give away, so I think I will. And I hope somebody needs story time, like I do. Okay, you're going to watch me do terrible things to the spine of a book. Look, there's Ophelia. Okay. And the pages. I fold pages. I have a bookmark here, like I'm civilized and don't fold pages and don't write in books, but I do. And I advise you to do the same. Unless, it's a library book, and then be nice to librarians and maybe don't. Okay. I'm going to have some coffee, and here is Ophelia Immune. Chapter 1, The Car. My older sister Imogen died wiping her little hands on her little eyes to clear them, her fingers filthy from clawing at the face of a zombie who had been trying to eat her. I was 6, she was 8. When my father saw that she was almost certainly infected, he said to me, "Ophelia, close your eyes," and he hammered her skull in, just like he had the zombies. We buried Imogen along the side of the road under billowing yellow grass. We knew that we shouldn't, but Dad said that he was pretty sure that he had put her to a final rest. We should have cut off her pigtailed head, closed her big brown eyes, and burned her all the way to a crisp, to make sure that she couldn't climb out of the ground and walk around again. But we didn't. We wrapped her up in the best wool blanket we had. We dug a hole 6 feet deep. We put her in, and we covered her up with dirt. I left her a daisy that I found, and then we were back in the car that Imogen and I grew up in. We never had a house. I couldn't remember the apartment that my mom said we had before the zombies came. I could only remember my sister with me in the back seat, in the arms of a ghoul at a rest stop, and then the cold, wet ground. The ground was too damp and chill for her warm fingers that passed me used crayons, so I imagined her still next to me, sharpening the ones that I broke. But the colors just built up in a pile on the empty seat while Mom cried and Dad clenched the steering wheel on our trip ever north. We were driving to the far north in our rusty maroon sedan. The far north, where at least the zombies froze every winter and we could buy a real house. On the cheap, from the government. Does any place up north really freeze? I asked Imogen's ghost. Will we really be safer in a wooden house without iron cages? Will I be alive to see it? Will I be alone forever without you? The empty seat said nothing. My crayons rolled onto the floor and the billboards faded to violent pastels as we chugged on past. We drove and drove as far as we could every day, past government contingency plans, past rangers with their uniforms and badges, their mottled pressboard signs with warnings and instructions, and abandoned hospitals shrouded in barbed wire. There were never enough supplies for the government contingency plans. There were holes in fences. No more plywood to cover the windows. Screens had to be repaired every morning, the sound of hammering nails, drawing the walking dead ever closer. They would eat you if they got the chance. They would steal your big sister while she gathered kindling. There were bricks piled along the ditches, awaiting sturdier construction projects. But there were also constant gardening and cooking to be done. Those who had foolishly bought houses where the zombies never froze had to do their chores under the threat of teeth and claws. There was wood chopping and clothes sewing and water fetching and diaper changing. With all of the living going on, it was hard to have time to prepare for the dead. So people got eaten. Dad worked on water pumps or grain elevators wherever we came upon dangerous mechanical jobs that needed doing. He was so tall and his arms were so wide that everybody with a broken machine wanted him to fix it. We kept his hammers and axes and big tools on hand for hitting the zombies on their heads when they ambled over. We drove as far as we could on every tank of gas, ignoring the pits full of swarming flies, laying their eggs on who knows who. We weren't lucky to find gas stations within range. Dad always calculated the gas to the minute and to the mile. He listened to the radio to hear which stations still advertised their supply, and then I marked them with a magenta crayon on my big map. Imogen had started it before me. She traced our path north with bright orange, a tangerine line stretching farther and farther north, a modeled portrait of years full of panicked breaths between gas stations. Nobody mentioned when we had to go backwards, back south, for Dad to find work or fuel. Imogen's ghost begged us to hurry, the hole where she used to sit clenching its jaws and forcing us into the future. Without Imogen, I lost track of time. I was growing slowly, but the windows of our sedan remained the same, only one set of nose and fingerprints coating them now. Mom patched and stitched my too short clothes, her nimble fingers making the needle dance across the fabric. She dressed me in Imogen's 3 outfits and then stitched and patched those when they became too small for my frame, which was delicate like hers. The silence and patience muted us, and the hordes of contagious beasts were winning until Mom could get pregnant and give me a new sister. She said I didn't fall asleep early enough in the back seat, but it was hard to sleep after the boredom of counting my own fingers and repacking my own crayons. When Mom's belly finally started to grow round and tight against the seatbelt, I hoped that Imogen would pop out again, fresh as a baby, unbitten and alive. But I knew it wouldn't be her. I was pretty sure. She was gone, and it was a good thing. When a zombie bit you, you lost your mind, and you became just like them, all teeth and jaws and chewing, unless somebody hit you in the head. If Dad hadn't clubbed her and buried her, she would have been just like the foul creatures that pressed themselves against the bars of our campsites at night, wandering alone forever. Imogen and I used to like the campsites. Being locked into an official campsite was a comforting sound, the heavy slam of the security gate closing, and the jangle of the ranger walking away with the keys on his belt. Each family or carful that could pay got their own cage until the camps were full for the night. Then I was allowed to get out and stretch my legs, which were painfully skinny after all of my seasons in the car. I could hardly jump, certainly not high enough to reach the top of the campsite cage, not even when I stood on top of the car's roof, which I also wasn't allowed to do. I pitied the hiking families. They always got to stretch their legs walking from camp to camp, but they only had tent roofs to keep the slime off of their heads, the slime that dripped down from the zombies who climbed on top of the cages at night after pushing themselves into a pile like a ramp. My knees didn't move so fast, but at least we drivers only had to wipe down a real solid roof in the morning. We wiped after the grown-ups and the rangers had slaughtered all of the undead that piled up around us during the night, with rubber gloves duct taped up over our elbows, when we had enough duct tape. Maybe you'd be okay if their blood landed on your clean, unbroken skin, but I once saw a ranger with a little tiny sliver that she didn't even know about get splashed on her fingers, and before she could even wash her hands, she was gray and sweating with the fever. She had to hand over her keyring before she was clubbed by her fellow ranger in his beige uniform and carefully adjusted leather work gloves. "Ophelia, stop staring off into nowhere. You look crazy." Mom called me to her and handed me warm beans spread to the edge of a stale sesame bun, the thing we had traded for the last of our coins. The girl in the cage next door looked at me while she spooned juicy canned peas into her mouth. It was only canned food, but peas were harder to find than black beans on my fresh bun. I traded her a bite for a spoonful, and then we inched away from each other, neither convinced that we were safe strangers. We were always on the lookout for something evil that will bite us, or someone sneaky who will steal us away from our parents and sell us to somebody looking for a wife to give them babies. We currently are worth a lot of money. We could give babies to those who want to buy us, or we could fill the house of ladies who got coins when we entertained men too scared to press themselves against girls who hadn't been checked for fresh infection. Girl grabbers sneak out of the pine trees and steal any girl silly enough to leave her safe cage and the supervision of the rangers. Dad smoothed the worry lines from my brow with his rough thumbs and pulled me onto his lap. This was harder than it used to be, despite my withered frame. Neither of us realized how old I was getting. My stunted legs and insomniac eyes never really woke up until he sang, or whistled, something cheery in the middle of the cramped boredom. If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this land. When he went to bed early to get up and find work the next day, Mom took over humming into my ear and patting the new sister inside of her finely pregnant belly. Now I know a refuge never grows from a head in a thoughtful pose. You gotta tend the earth if you want a rose. She snuggled and the ragged wool blanket around my knees and tugged me down flat on the back seat so that I wouldn't crick my neck using the door for a pillow. Ophelia, you are my rose, so pretty, and we will grow a garden someday. She patted my unborn sister again and reclined in her own seat to sleep. But I didn't receive a new sister. I was given a new brother, born in a campsite with horrible infected blood dripping onto the windshield, while Mom panted in labor. It was really kind of exciting, the smell of healthy scarlet human blood just barely seeping from who knew where beneath her. Her groans were not terrible, but rather guaranteed that I would finally be a sister again. And when I woke up in the morning, I was. Maybe I had slept through the entire car ride up until then. It was exhausting hoping for the future. But I woke up when he arrived, and I cursed the dreams that I'd been having about my crayons melting and disappearing into the upholstery. There he was, wrinkled and braying at the top of his lungs, flushed a beautiful glowing brown. All of our neighbors cheered when Mom stepped out in the morning, happy for her that she no longer had only one child to lose. They hadn't been sure, until they saw the baby, what her moaning had been all about. She beamed from ear to ear, her hand firmly on top of my head, pivoting me with her to show everyone in all directions that she had 2 healthy children. Then Mom ducked back inside the car to teach Hector how to nurse and how to tell us tales of the civilized world before the zombies had come. I used to work in department stores that sold beautiful ruffled blouses in shades of fuchsia, violet, and teal. Imogen loved the fancy clothes, but you, Ophelia, would just haul her off by the hand and run through the racks of clothing to play hide and seek, hooting and hollering until you fell asleep against your big sister. You clenched the microwave popcorn in your fists on the floor of the break room like you wouldn't ever get any more, and I guess you were right. Your cheeks were stuffed like a chipmunk, and Imogen was scared that you would choke on a kernel, so she stayed awake and watched you, snuggled into her side, snoring with your stuffy nose. She wiped a tear from her eye before it could fall. Ophelia, my Ophelia, you are 12 now. You are the big sister. 12. 6 years gone from Imogen? 4 years of forward and backwards and sideways to jobs and gas and campsites? 6 years of stunted growth and silent gazing? No New Year's, no birthdays, just desperate navigation and waiting for the North to present itself possible. How much longer would it be? How long would my little brother last? How much longer will I last? Ophelia, do you hear me? You are the big sister now. You have to look out for Hector, just like Imogen did for you. She was right. I'm 12. It was time to be a big sister. A hot tear escaped Mom's cheek and dripped onto sleeping Hector, whom she set in my arms. She squeezed both of us close and pulled my hair too tight while she braided it. She wiped her tears on her sleeve and grabbed one of Imogen's leftover barrettes, clamped my sister's shiny plastic around the end of one of my pigtails, and lectured me about the importance of not being such a tomboy. Hector's arrival gave us life to be more careful with. She made me note that hogging all the snacks was not appropriate. Picking flea bites is not civilized. Snoring is not attractive. Brown is beautiful. Car camping is no excuse to look unkempt, though. We can't afford to look ragged. Hector was dandled and hugged and dabbled with washcloths until he glowed again. Our singing increased to several times a day. I grew older while I took care of him. The car was more spacious with him inside of it. There used to be, I mimicked Mom's tone, stores and parties and music on the radio. Dad packed up the car with his tools every morning instead of with us. He sang with the radio instead of using it to find gas and barter for jobs. Dad snuck up behind us and scooped Hector into his arms. There's more than one answer to these questions, pointing me in a crooked line, he sang. Dad and I twirled Hector in circles between the walls of our cage. Mom folded the blankets she had just shaken out, trying not to smile at our wildness. The slamming of the car doors distracted us. 3 cars pulled into the campsite line that we had been in earlier, before we had paid and been gladly locked inside. The first car in line was a station wagon, plenty full of brown kids just like me, sitting on their hands and trying to behave like I have done so many times. But they have nothing else. No cartons of food or tools or crayons. They must be brand new to the road. The second car in line is a real working Smithson G4 with unscratched fins, intact taillights, and a very pale driver. Nobody has seen a purring G4 in ages. It's shiny and in mint condition, which is funny because it's kind of a pearly minty color too. I say so to Hector and he chuckles over it. We whistle from afar, faces pressed against the mesh of our campsite fence. Dad paced out of our cage with other admirers to touch the smooth finish and nod with the pale owner. Dad can't resist looking at a nicely greased gear and motor set. I too marvel over the magical silver rims and the unbroken side mirrors, so much shinier than the iron bars I grip. And I glance nervously at the unremarkable wood paneling of the station wagon in the front of the line. The station wagon family is just as dark as us, brown and in an unremarkable car, a shabby vehicle with no extra money for bribes, because like everybody sensible, they are buying food instead of hubcaps. There are only 2 sites left, a long line of cars starting to show up, and the rangers get to choose to whom they would be given. If they didn't feel guilty enough about giving the last 2 sites away to pale folks, or for emergency reasons, nobody would speak up and say that the decision was just because of the color. There was nothing that could be done about it, no proof, nobody to report to, nobody who could be contacted on the same day while it still mattered. Dad finally glanced around at the line and got as worried for the Brown family as he should have been. My mechanical engineer father slipped quietly away from the call of the fresh oil in the Smithson motor and paced back into our campsite, mostly looking at his feet. He didn't stop me, so I kept right on staring at our rightful neighbors, the Brown family, at the front of the line. The third car that pulled into line, behind the station wagon and behind the Smithson G4, was an old Zodiac with a tattered canvas roof and a deflated tire. It wasn't sturdy enough to protect the owner at night, but there weren't any kids inside who needed special protection. It was just a single peachy man. He stepped out wearing a rough leather hat, his mirrored sunglasses contrasting against his translucent skin. The grumpy ranger finally roused himself from his desk at the entrance hut. He walked past the Brown family's ordinary station wagon to the second man in line with the minty Smithson G4. He handed the pale owner a petition for special protection and waddled to the door of the peachy man in the cloth-topped Zodiac. The ranger loaned the waxy cowboy a pen for the petition for special protection. When the cowboy had finished, he and the ranger stood jovially, joking about the shape of the mud on the hood. It looked like a cow, a butchered cow. They loved it. The ranger banged the Zodiac's mud hood happily, slipped his hand once more over the sleek, shiny Smith & G4's fins, and then he made the "move over" sign to the Brown family in the front of the line. The Brown father stuttered and thought enough to reach for the pad of petition for special protection forms, because they clearly had more than 3 children who he swept his arms at broadly. They obviously needed special protection. He held up his fingers to show their ages. He opened his trunk to show that it was empty of supplies and that he needed to barter work for food. He begged and bowed on one knee, but the ranger gripped the pad of papers more tightly. He signed "move over" one more time, and he strode away, fingering the keys to the last 2 sites that he had already given away. The Smiths and G4 and the ragged Zodiac eased around the other Brown family's wagon so that they could back up and go find someplace else to park. We didn't look up to wave at them, and we didn't catch anybody else's eye either. It was sad, but they probably knew how to handle themselves and didn't need our pity. Or what if we spoke up and we had to go with them next? What if we invited them in to our cage and then the ranger was mad at us and also one of them was infected and bit us during the night? We just shivered and pretended to be asleep at 3 a.m. when we heard them scream and their windows shattering, a chorus of voices in different ages and pitches, ringing in our ears for only a few minutes. They should have known better. Why didn't they know better? If you can't get a campsite, you don't sleep in your car. You find a tree that the beast can't reach you in, and then they leave your car alone because you're not in it, so you don't have broken windows the next day. But we never miss getting a campsite. Dad is obsessively early to the line until the ground freezes. When the ground froze, all of the zombies froze too, so you didn't need bars to protect you. And that was when Juliet arrived. Juliet, another baby to keep us busy. Hector and I were not destined to be alone. Mom was finally on a roll. Our little sister Juliet was born in icy weather, only the year after Hector. I was 11. I was counting time now, and we are farther north, just outside the big city of Turrington. We can't afford the clinic that we could see with its big red cross painted on its frosty bricks, so Mom just used the front seat again. We couldn't open the windows to dry out the car. If we did, the wet spots on the upholstery would freeze and chap our skin. So we stayed balmy and wrinkled, smelling of umbilical cord and tasting briny for days. Hector and I sat in the back, sipping from glass jars of melted snow that I had sweetened with honey. All of the adults older than 16 hiked the hillsides, putting spikes into zombies' heads and pulling the frozen corpses through the snow to burn piles. Except for Mom, who sat in the front seat giving birth to Juliet. She wailed, and the insides of the car steamed and baked with the effort of a new baby. I took care of Hector like Imogen would have me. When he couldn't laugh at my funny faces anymore, I slathered some crackers with jam. We didn't get much jam, but the sugar would be good for him, I thought. It would help him fall asleep before Mom really started to push. Besides, he was going to have to get used to Mom's milk being for somebody else. He did fall asleep soundly, but I stayed awake to see Dad come back to the car just in time to scrub himself with alcohol and a towel to pull Juliet from somewhere down near the floorboards of Mom's passenger side. In the morning, we chucked the bags of afterbirth and ruined towels on top of the burn piles with corpses. Dad thought we should bury them near a tree to help it grow, and that the tree could be named Juliet too. Mom told him not to be such a gross romantic, and looked around to see if anyone had heard him say something so uncivilized. Nobody even looked up. Juliet wailed in the stiff chill. Imogen would have loved her. She was a sweet baby who cried more than Hector did, but she made the car smell better, like flowery drool instead of poopy fingernails.
Hector stared at her a lot, chattering instead of talking. He taught her how to stick out her tongue before she could smile. Mom wasn't so happy about that. Bad enough we were living in our soiled car until Dad could make the rest of the money that we needed to buy an abandoned house on the cheap from the government. Worse yet, that my little brother could barely walk or talk better than his year-younger sister, who he kept giving bad habits to. Juliet sprouted, lean and coordinated from the beginning. She spoke before she turned one. Her favorite phrases delighted us almost as much as her long, curly eyelashes did. Honey, please. Hug me. Happy birthday. Be careful. Hector, no. I watched them grow instead of staring out of the window by myself. I had 2 toddlers to watch out for. I threw them birthday parties with extra beans spread across their sesame buns. We counted to 10, and then 20 on our fingers, and then toes. We played pat a cake until they could clap the most complicated versions with their eyes closed. I had to make sure they developed despite our pinched quarters. Hector finally took to walking, 2 years after he should have. Once we had the space to move around in the largest campsite cage any of us had ever seen. Dad got a long-term job at a river with a dam that was falling apart. Most people were too scared to go near the water because everybody knew that the zombies and the horrible, slimy, infected fish were in it. But Dad said he could balance on the dam, bash in heads, and fix the girding beams all at once. We spent more seasons than we wanted to count patiently waiting for him to come home and be locked inside before dark. He always made it safely, whistling with something delicious thrown in the sack over his shoulder. He came home with fresh venison haunches, snow hares, or duck eggs. And when he shared with the rangers, they gave us an expensive, deluxe campsite that we could roam around in, free of worry. Mom and I wore our backs out, hunched over, working 3- and 4-year-old muscles, stretching Juliet and Hector until they could move all their joints like they should. We dusted their blankets so their noses didn't constantly run, and braided their hair so that they didn't look like ragamuffins. Until Dad showed up one afternoon, well before dusk, with his burlap goodie bag fuller than usual. The first item he waved before us and passed around gingerly was a rolled-up scroll of paper. Paper is expensive, but I didn't see why it was so exciting or why Mom was crying until Dad told me what it was. It wasn't a receipt or a scrap of nice kindling that he had found. It was the deed to our new house. The dam was finished, and we finally had the cash to spend on a real house. Our new house was an abandoned one outside of a small town, even a little bit farther north, in Nasmith. Hector galloped around like a maniac, and Juliet skipped steadily back and forth between Mom and Dad, all of us chanting, "Nasmith! Nasmith!" until the ranger asked us to simmer down. Dad didn't want us scaring people or provoking them to rob us, so we hushed. Dad handed Mom 2 paper packages, one full of powdery beige flour, the other brimming with sugar, dark brown and sticky sweet. She beamed at him, and she let us each lick 1 fingerful of the amber crystals before she hid them under the front seat. Dad gave Juliet and Hector each a wooden pull toy attached to a long twine, a painted green duck, and an etched gray goose that flapped their feet as the wheels turned. I high-fived Hector, and then Juliet, and then Dad, agreeing that these were the best gifts ever. But there was more. Dad wasn't finished yet. There was something for me. He reached into the bottomless sack and handed me my very own, brand new, bright blue hammer. You're going to need this hammer, Ophelia, for building and for killing. There are going to be a lot more zombies to kill on the farm in Nasmith. There won't be a cage, just wide open spaces and fresh air. You're going to have to learn. I'm going to count on you. You can help me make our home. I loved it. I could build the future and defend my family with its sturdy handle and its shiny steel head. I kissed it, which made Dad laugh, and then I propped it in the back window where it wouldn't fall on anybody's little head or fingers accidentally. I was 15, and I thought I could handle a heavy hammer, especially with such a beautiful one. But we were all still too small for our ages. Perhaps the fresh northern wind sweeping through our own windows would help us sprout and straighten our teeth. With a tank full of gas and our deed in the glove compartment, we couldn't sit still for the rest of our car ride north. We whisper chanted, "Nasmith, Nasmith," until we all got too loud and Mom scolded us. She wondered if we'd stolen and eaten all of her sugar. I tickled the kids until we couldn't giggle anymore. Nasmith came before our new house. High, pitted speed bumps announced the edges of the incorporated part. It looked like every other small town that we had passed through. The first floors of any houses left standing were vacant. The second floors of most were turned into shops and businesses and living quarters for the owners and the tenders. Dad gave a solid wave to the hikers and the townies that we passed, moving very slowly so as to not frighten anyone, but they just looked at us with frowns and tilted their heads. Mom pointed out the fabric store to me, the church and the post office. They all had nicely cleared first floors with sturdy gates sprawled across their entrances and solid ladders up to their working sections. There was the baker, the smith, the priest. That was where we would mail our letters once a month. That was where we would go to the funeral feasts of our new neighbors. And at the end of town, a small, fair boy with freckles loaded his slingshot and sent a pebble in our direction with his tongue stuck out. I smiled and waved to show no hard feelings. I pushed the squirming and shouting little kids off my lap and traced the final crayon line on Imogen's old tattered map. I drew a thick, waxy star over the small town of Nasmith with a little arrow, pointing to the plot an hour away where our house would be. I folded up the map and tucked it into my back pocket as we pulled off the road onto our winding gravel driveway. We parked and turned off the engine. A quiet terror settled over me as we stared at our huge new home out of the old car's windows. I gripped my new blue hammer harder. So that's the first chapter of Ophelia Immune, and that's what I have to offer us for a story time. I can give these words away to you. I can hope that it is catharsis. I can hope that it is finding a hero who's not a white little boy in the middle of really tough times. Happy Story Hour.